Planning for inclusive teaching and learning. And this is part 2 on the topic of creating inclusive lesson plans. Before going ahead, can I please ask you to read the following slide? The content of this presentation is focused on 10 steps for the planning of inclusive music teaching and learning. If you are doing the ABRSM CME course, then the content of this presentation is aligned with Module 2, Assignments 2A and 2B, and ABRSM learning outcomes all within 2.1 and all within 2.2. If you are doing the Trinity CME course, then the content of this presentation is aligned with Module 2, Assessment Tasks 2A, 2B, and 2C, and Trinity learning outcomes all within Learning Outcome 1, that is from 1.1 to 1.8 inclusive. So, steps for creating effective lesson plans. The first step really is to know your learners very well and the educational context. Even whenever you are using a certain lesson plan that was taken from a certain course book or a template, or when using guidance on how to teach specific concepts to specific year groups, you will still need to decide how this is going to go, what should be important to cover as well for that specific group of learners. So answers to this will be found by actually answering these questions. The first is, who are the learners? And of course, you want to know, generally speaking, what is the ages, or what are the ages of these children or young people? What are their musical backgrounds? What are their musical preferences? What previous music learning experiences did they've had? What are their learning needs? Specific circumstances, or even some conditions which could be considered even as learning difficulties, for example, or others. After that, you'll want to consider your own aims as a teacher for that development. So you want to consider the course overall and the appropriate recommended progression pathways, and that leads us to how a lesson can fit into a group of 10 lessons or a group of 20 lessons, and so on. You also need to have a very clear understanding about what context, in what context is this learning going to occur. Is it going to be at a school? And if so, is there an institutionalized music education curriculum that you are required to follow? Or if you will have to create, and you have the freedom somehow to create a curriculum that is very much student-centered and focusing much more on your students as the departing point for creating of what learning is going to occur. Or is it, for example, are you teaching from your own home, your own teaching studio on a one-to basis or a group basis, or in an academy, or even in a community center? The second step is to outline learning outcomes and learning objectives for the learners. And here we need to focus a little bit on some definitions and understand how we can do this. So learning outcomes describe or list measurable and essential knowledge, skills, and competencies that learners can demonstrate when they have achieved what is supposed for them to achieve by the end of a lesson or by the end of a course. And it's extremely important that you establish learning outcomes and learning objectives, because in a way, this is like establishing the pathway that you need to follow as well to materialize those learning outcomes for your learners, but also they need to be designed in such a way that then you can effectively and fairly and as objectively as possible to assess if those outcomes were achieved or not. So the word outcome really denotes that there needs to be an end product that can be assessed against predefined criteria. And for this reason, learning outcomes need to be really clear, specific, and measurable so that they can be properly assessed. Clear and measurable learning outcomes will not only provide information about what the learner has achieved, but it will also report on the success or otherwise of your teaching and how appropriate as well the assessment process that you have put in place or the school has put in place is fit for purpose or not. So although learning outcomes are certainly helpful from the point of view of assessment, their main purpose should be to provide a direction towards specific and tailored learning trajectories, really. Learning outcomes must be achievable and also realistic. And they must allow each learner to further develop their musical potential. And where possible, you always want to work in partnership with your students. So when you can have your learners having a say and agreeing on that learning journey that you are proposing to them or that they have themselves mentioned, and that you have somehow balanced and agree with them on that trajectory, that will help the developing independent learners who take ownership for their learning. While learning outcomes can be considered as statements that concern the overall goals of teaching, learning objectives actually then describe the individual stages which learners must progress to achieve the learning outcomes. So learning objectives can be described as steps that students and you need to work on together to reach the learning outcome, which is the wider statement in itself. So to clarify, I'm going to give an example here in the next slide. So let's take this example. It could be any example really, but I chose an example here from teaching music theory. And so for a music theory lesson, so the learning outcome could be such that it would be, for example, by the end of the lesson, learners will demonstrate knowledge on the construction of major scales. So this is the outcome, or one of the outcomes I have created. So basically I want the learners, or I would like that the learners by the end of the lesson would be able to demonstrate knowledge on how to build major scales. Okay, so this is the learning outcome. Now the learning objectives. So what steps do I and the learners need to somehow clarify in order for this outcome to be materialized? So objectives would be that, well, to do this, learners will need to be able to identify the location of tones and semitones in major scales. Also, learners will describe the practical application of accidentals in relation to major scales construction. Also, learners will understand and apply the circle of fifths to describe key signatures of given major scales. So basically, it's like without these learning objectives materialize and without an understanding and achievement of these learning objectives, it's going to be almost impossible to actually achieve the learning outcome. And that's how the learning objectives work very symbiotically with the learning outcome, because the learning objectives do provide those steps. What do you need to learn, what you need to master before you can actually then reach the full learning outcome. And in terms of designing or creating learning outcomes and learning objectives, you might have heard about what's being called as the SMART acronym. which is credited to both Peter Drucker in 1955 and George Doran in 1981, which is a very helpful tool to design these learning outcomes. So the word SMART is a combination of the starting of these other words we have here, and they all provide like a description of what you want this learning outcome and the learning objective to really be. So the S stands for it must be specific really. The M stands for measurable. How will we know that this was achieved? The A is for achievable. So we cannot ask impossible things from our students, really. It has to be achievable. And with that also goes the R for being realistic. Are we really able to teach all this or to have our students learning all this in the amount of time that we have in our lessons, or considering the students' specific circumstances? And is it timely? Timely, is this relevant in the student's life at this point in time? Is this presented at the right time within the curriculum and all the other things that we have done and in the proper sequence? So for more on this, and I do have much more detailed explanations on how to do this in my book entitled Certificate for Music Educators Guidebook, Teaching Children and Young People, which is specific for learners doing the CME course as well. So in order to ensure that your lessons are successful, it is very, very important that you ensure that these desired outcomes and the learning objectives are SMART. And you know by SMART what I mean. I just described it before. And they should be, clear for you as teachers and also for your learners. The third step is about developing then the lesson introduction. Okay, you decided what is important to teach and why. And now you want to know, okay, how will I start presenting this concept to my students? So once those learning outcomes and the learning objectives are created, now it is then time to start understanding what learning activities you will incorporate from start to finish. So if you're teaching a group of learners, they will be a diverse group of learners, really, with different academic and personal experiences, different motivations, different interests, different backgrounds, and you need to consider that. They may or not be familiar with the topic that you are introducing. So you might want to begin the lesson perhaps with a short warm-up that actually that the group is familiar with, in order to bring them all together to the start of the lesson in a friendly and also in a confident way. And then you could use that warm-up to depart then to introducing the concepts that you want them to grasp in that lesson. You can also develop an interesting, inquisitive kind of introduction that somehow provides a contextualization for the topic to stimulate motivation. Maybe it's about starting with a musical story that introduces a new concept that you want to show them, for example. Or it's about talking about a historical, real event. I mean, usually children are very curious about real events too, and they also like stories. Or even putting forward a controversial idea and then asking their opinions. So who would go more with this, who would go with that, and then from that depart to introduce the topic, or even to present a short video or audio clip and take it from there. The next step, step 4, is about planning specific learning activities and teaching methodologies. So here you'll want to consider the variety of ways for learners to engage more experientially with the learning material. So basically, you don't want the lesson to be such that you are just talking, but in which there is activities, experimentation, children do things, and by doing things they learn. So this will also help them to keep them engaged, and it will also appeal to a variety of different learning styles by using different methodologies. So these can include, of course, the use of gestures and body movements, clapping rhythms, singing, real-life performance situations, watching and observing audio-visual material and then commenting on them, and many, many other ways. So There's a variety of different learning methodologies that you might want to actually consider. So these include play, so providing opportunities for musical play, but also to even embed playing with other activities, which could be with singing, with acting, with developing creativity, of course, at all times. Differentiation techniques, so these have more to do whenever you have a student perhaps with a specific learning difficulty, and you take that into account and you somehow make a very tailored plan to help that student to learn. And that plan could be used across the entire group as well, because it also provides a different means of engagement with the learning material for the learners in class. Talk and discussion is always very helpful, and we can always talk about how was that performance? Did you enjoy? Did you not enjoy? What do you think we can do better next time? So talking with an aim of helping students also to develop reflective and even reflexive abilities and skills. Learning through collaboration, so you can put them in groups where they would create a composition, or they would perform even perhaps a duet or a trio, and learn through this collaborative process of creating something together or putting something together. Developing higher orders thinking too. You can as well give them a challenge in a kind of a puzzle or something that it's to be solved. So how can they come up with strategies to solve? You can also put them into a kind of discovery process, and that discovery can be guided. So you can give them some clues, and then they would have to go and find and discover. You can also use peer learning. So basically, even by knowing that you might have certain students in the group that perhaps are a bit more advanced in their learning, and splitting them up into groups, where a group would always have perhaps as well one of those students who is a little bit more advanced, and they could do collaborative work. And in this case, we would have perhaps the students who are slightly more advanced, perhaps helping the ones who are less advanced to develop further as well. So here, in terms of play, there are so many different types of play. The reason why I'm showing all this here is because I really would like you to consider the importance of play in learning, because play does stimulate motivation, creativity, and imagination. And it is really demonstrated as a crucial aspect in development. And there are so many different forms of play that sometimes we don't think more deeply in terms of all the different types of plays that we could use in the classroom. So imaginative play is the type of play where learners can pretend that they are someone else, or that they are somewhere else. So let's imagine you're singing, and maybe there is a popular singing person that your students admire. You could ask them, so let's pretend you are Bruno Mars, for example. Or let's pretend that you were Lady Gaga, for example. How would you interpret this song? Let's pretend, let's imagine. Other type of play is what is considered as manipulative or constructive play. So here you can use natural or man-made musical instruments, toys, and other equipment. And learners would physically engage in learning by using their fine and gross motor skills as well as they go along. So they can even create instruments, musical instruments, perhaps not like the more traditional instruments that we know, or perhaps I'm not asking you to ask them to build a piano or to build specifically a guitar as we think of a guitar, but we can make sound and music with a variety of different things. That includes cooking pans and pots and plastic boxes and so many different things. And through that experience, they're also learning what sounds come out, what sounds do they like best. And you can use them in structured ways, for example, perhaps for them to perform a certain rhythm that you'd like them to perform in this new instrument that they have built. Creative play involves creating something that is not available before the activity has started. So that can be creating an instrument, or what we could think of, let's say, a sound-making object but it can also be creating a new composition, a new work, either through the use of technology or just by improvisation. And I've done this type of work with a group of students in terms of creative play, where they were asked to improvise with each other. They all had some instrumental music background, but from different instruments, and they were working in groups of 4 to 5 students. And in the first day, it was chaotic. I mean, they really struggled to understand how can they do this. But after that, my goodness, they just started. They really, they started understanding more. This was about, creating some musical ideas and then sharing it with colleagues, and then understanding how they could, and agreeing how they all put this together with different instruments. So it was lovely work. They worked like this for a week, and they loved it. And honestly, for us teachers as well, it was very rewarding experience just to even listen to the music that came out of that experience, and that sense of belonging that they've had, like, this is what our group made, this is our piece. So it was really, really nice. Other type of play includes language, rhythm, and pitch games, musical memory games as well. You can also use cooperative play, competitive play, even where groups are, it's about perhaps winning a prize as well, or free flow play, where there isn't a structure given as such, versus something that does have a structure. So this means when teachers and plan for specific learning outcomes, the control is within the teacher. However, if the teacher observes the learners and provides opportunities for the learners to choose tasks and outcomes, then the control is with the learners. So you can think and see what would be more appropriate in the context, or you can try both these out and then see through reflective practice what works best. We talked a little bit about differentiation early on, but just in a bit more detail here. So differentiation is about adapting teaching to suit learners of different abilities and diverse learning characteristics, including different learning styles. So for this, we need, as teachers, to recognize that the different needs that our learners do have and plan to meet those needs. This will be very good because it will help removing some of the possible barriers that learners experience in their learning, and it will grant them an opportunity to access high quality learning. Some differentiation strategies include, when you adapt your own teaching style, also thinking of the pace that you use for teaching. Perhaps you need to go a little bit more slowly here, or you need to use different learning resources, or maybe you need to get more support in the class, perhaps a teaching assistant or another teacher with you, and so on. Talk and discussion, again, we talked about that earlier, so I'm not going to go deeply on those concepts right now. In terms of use of the higher order thinking and problem solving, this is all about developing skills of analyzing, summarizing, concluding, discovering, and being creative. Guided discovery, we talked about it earlier, and peer tutoring too. So you will want to estimate how much time is required for each of the activities, depending on what you decided to go with, and also account for this in terms of the possible need of spending more time in one task than the other. So you need to be flexible. And it might need that actually you're doing your work, you're teaching, and learners are grasping things really quickly, and in which case you might need to have another activity there planned, that if you need to move quickly to the other activity, you can do so. So when creating a lesson plan, it is good practice to plan a variety of content and a variety of different activities for specific circumstances. So you could think, well, what about if the learners are not following? What about if they're going to struggle with how to learn triplets today? What if, so think of what if, and then think of what could be done in that situation. Step 5 is about planning to check for understanding. So how will we know that students are learning? And they're following as well. So what specific questions can you perhaps ask in the class in order to check for understanding? But also, and very importantly, what can you have your learners do for knowledge and skill development to be demonstrated? And so you can see really what's happening in the learning. Anticipating learners' difficulties and questions is also an important element of a lesson. So anticipating what could they potentially struggle with is relevant. Step 6 is about developing a lesson conclusion. So you've done the lesson, you introduced the topic, you had different activities for them to do. But now at the end of the lesson, it's really important to summarize the main learning points of the lesson. So don't just let the lesson finish without giving them a summary of main points that they can take in their front part of the memory, let's say. And also have feedback on their learning experience. How did it go for them? How are they feeling about this new learning? Did they enjoy? What have they struggled the most in this lesson? And then also make them curious. Tell them, very briefly, what is the next lesson going to be about? In terms of how you do this summary of lessons, you could either do the summary yourself, or you can even ask learners to help you summarize the main points by asking them, so what have we done today? Who would like to say one of the points we have done today? And with this, you can also understand how attentive they were during the lesson. Step 7 is about creating a timeline. Time is of the essence, and you really need to develop good time management skills. If the lesson is supposed to be half an hour, then it should not be 31 minutes. Preferably even be like 29 to 30. But if it's half an hour, it should not also be just 20 minutes. So time management is important. And when considering time management, it's really important to consider that a list of many learning objectives, it's not going to work. It would not be realistic to be achievable in one lesson. It's best to narrow it down to 2 or 3 main concepts or ideas that you want your students to develop. Teachers also often need to adjust the plan to the learners as you go along, so take that into consideration. A pragmatic timeline side by side to alternative activities will be very helpful and also help you to develop those flexibility and adaptability skills that we need to develop. It is very important also to estimate how much time each activity would take and anticipate that and create that timeline then. Also give a little bit of extra time towards the end to check if there are any questions or if there's something that the students are needing more support with. And make sure you have ready an extra activity shall you need to move quickly to something else because actually learners have already mastered what you wanted them to do. Step 8 is about thinking of what resources are available to you and your learners. So make a list of everything you need for your lesson and consider if you have them or not. And if you don't, how can you adapt the plan? Things to do with resources include even the location of the lesson and even the type of room. It should take place in an appropriate location and appropriate room. Do you need to prepare the room beforehand with instruments? And perhaps if you want students to sit in a circle in a carpet in the ground, for example, you might need time to do that room setup. But if there's a lesson before, exactly before your lesson there, and you only have 5 minutes to prepare, will you be able to do that? And will you be able to do that alone? Or perhaps you would need to ask help from someone to actually help you set up the environment. Also think about temperature, because you want your students to feel comfortable, and you want to consider as well safety considerations. You want to do a risk assessment of all your teaching to ensure that there are no hazards or anything that could go wrong. If you're using electrical equipment such as computers and other devices, then you really need to be very careful, for example, with any wires that are connected to the electricity, so that a student could trip and take an electric shock. So what measures are you going to put in place to prevent that? And it's for situations like this that having a risk assessment is extremely important. A risk assessment, you will identify potential problems, potential challenges, and then right beside it, what are you doing to mitigate or to actually prevent completely those problems of occurring? And it could be any unexpected thing. Let's imagine perhaps it's a student that faints. So what measures, what would you have to have in place to ensure that that student's going to be fully well supported and that you're going to do your work professionally? So that would mean having a first aid course, perhaps, and certification. And if you don't, to ensure that in that school, you know exactly where the first aider is located quickly, and you can, what is the process? Are you going to ask one student to go quickly and run to the first aider? Or how is that going to be done? Or is there a telephone in the room? What if that telephone is busy? How would you reach that person really quickly? So it's about thinking about all possible and imaginary situations and being ready, because at the end of the day, you are responsible to provide a safe learning environment. And you're responsible at all levels, morally, professionally, and legally. So it's not because you're teaching in a school that you can assume that, yes, everything is right, everything is in place. No, you do have responsibility, like myself and all our teachers, to check. And if you identify a problem, it's our duty to bring that up with the school administration and help them to find solutions. Step 9, I think I run over step 9 in the previous slide anyways, so I'm not going to go in depth here, but just to re-emphasize the importance of doing a risk assessment. Another thing that you want to consider, especially in the use of musical instruments, is if you're going to use school-based wind instruments. And of course, this could be a terrible source of infections. I mean, I would say you have to put in place something else. Perhaps it's about each student having their own instrument with labels and all that. And do they take these instruments home, or do they stay there? And if they stay there, how can you ensure that they are clean and safe for use by learners? And of course, COVID has put a lot of strain in terms of considerations in terms of social distancing and cleaning, and all that also needs to be in your risk assessment for teaching. If you're also going to teach online, of course, there are a lot of considerations at that level, even if it's distance learning, but online in real time. So there will be even child safeguarding considerations that you'll want to also consider in your lesson plan. If children are going to be using headphones, how will you ensure that these are not a source of infections or ear infections? So I would suggest that headphones would not be shared at all, and that perhaps children would use their own. And also, how will you ensure that healthy sound levels are maintained to ensure that there is no hearing difficulty or hearing damage? It could be terrible if a student puts their headphones on and the sound is on the maximum, and suddenly they get a shock of sound which could actually cause terrible damage to their ears. So you have to consider all that. And could the planned activities have the potential to cause disruption? I listen to many teachers that telling me, well, in a room full of instruments, it can be really difficult to maintain appropriate children behavior. But it is possible with strategies, and we do have other lectures on promoting positive behavior. And for that also you should have a promoting positive behavior policy, but that's part of a different module. So also for teachers working at schools, for example, or public institutions, it's very likely that there will be policies in place, and you really need to read those policies, because those policies detail the steps that the school has put in place and the steps that you should follow for in cases to do with, let's say, health and safety, first aid, child protection, internet safety, handling of electrical equipment, manual handling, fire safety, data protection, and other elements as appropriate. And it's also likely that schools and institutions would have done a risk assessment to the venue. But if you find something that is not listed that needs to be added to their list, then you need to bring that up with them. And it's also your responsibility to get acquainted with all these policies. So if they don't send you these policies or tell you where they are, you should ask for the policies and read them, because it's your responsibility. If you are teaching in your own private studio, you also need to do all these things. But again, it will be you doing it, which is hard work, but you'll still need to do a risk assessment of your own teaching space and surrounding area. If a student was going to faint in your own house, or if you're teaching in their own house, how is it going to be? How will you deal with this situation, for example? And you will, of course, need to revise these policies periodically, either once a year or twice a year, and also make sure that your own policies are in alignment with the guidance from the appropriate authorities in your own country and context in all matters, including health and safety and child protection and so on. So you will need to have in place at least these policies: health and safety, first aid, fire policy, child protection, data protection, and ensure revision and training as needed. For example, if you teach in your own studio, you want to have a certification on child protection. You'll also might find beneficial to actually to do a first aid training for pediatric safety, and beyond that, depending on your who are you teaching, if you also teach adults or not. You also need to have in place all the required insurances as per legal requirements. So, for example, public liability, and a variety of other insurances that will, as applicable to your own teaching. And as I mentioned, I think in the previous presentation, some professional bodies in the UK will, alongside the membership, if you do have a membership with them, provide you many of these insurances as part of your membership. So I strongly advise you that you become a member of a professional body. Step 10 is about planning for reflection on your lesson plan and lesson delivery. So include time for reflection and think of what worked well and why, and what may require improvement. Don't worry if your plan didn't work as well as you wanted it to work. It's all about understanding why it hasn't worked and what can be done next time for improvement. The life of a teacher is a life of learning. We learn with the situations that happen and occur. So each lesson we plan and deliver provides that great learning opportunity for next times. Also obtaining feedback from others on your teaching. So learners' feedback, parents' feedback, peer observation, video recordings of your teacher and of your teaching, and be aware if you're going to do video recordings of your teaching that you need permission from the parents and guardians of these children, but also if you're teaching at the school, also of the school principal and your line manager as well. And this permission should be a written permission where you explain exactly how you're going to use these video recordings, how you're going to store this material, and of course assure them that you are not going to post this material in social media or online. So, and to conclude, and as a summary of this lecture here, appropriate and effective planning is the key for our teaching success. And our teaching success will always be reflected through the ways in which our learners learn, from all the perspectives that are mentioned here, such as how they achieve the learning outcomes, what levels of satisfaction do our learners take away from their learning with us, their motivation and willingness to make music as an everyday life element and also as a way of expressing themselves. And if you'd like to read more deeply about the content of this lecture, here are the references that were used.